everybody. Welcome back to the Music Buds podcast. This is episode number 43, and my name is Henry. This week, I'm honored to be joined by composer Ron Fish, known partly for his work on the God of War video game franchise, as well as Batman Arkham City and Asylum, and many others. Ron, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. As I've said to you before, I really am a fan of your work, so thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure being here, Henry.
Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, how's life for you these days?
I'm kind of recuperating from a 3-month tour there in China, Beijing, where I was working on a project that I guess I can discuss it, but it's the new Universal theme park. So that was quite a cool experience, and doing mixing and sound design over there for 3 months, and a different lifestyle for sure than here in America. So that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, I guess kind of kicking things off, how is it that you got started in music? Was music something you had always wanted to do?
Music was always played in my household. My mother was a pianist, and she would be playing classical music about 5 hours a day. She would put the crib next to her piano, and she just continued playing all the time. So I'd be hearing classical music throughout my early days. And then after that, I found some band called the Beatles and went, wow, this is also pretty cool. So, and then, Rolling Stones and all that kind of stuff. So it was and then it was jazz, and I kind of lighted onto the Buddy Rich Big Band. So kind of an eclectic listening palette when I was younger. But I always did appreciate the classics. So I would say, that I've always had music in my life, pretty much.
Yeah. Well, how did composing come along?
Composing came along slower, as I was a drummer. For most of my years, I was drumming for a living. But I always noodled on a piano. And I went to Berklee College of Music for some time there and studied with an arranger called Mike Gibbs, who used to work with the Vishnu John McLaughlin orchestra. So he was amazing. And he taught me so much about musical constructs and how we as listeners actually listen to music and how we digest music. He taught me quite a lot as far as arranging. And from that point on, I decided that I needed to express myself musically rather than just be playing drums, which there's no knock on drums because I still love them.
Sure.
But I needed something larger to be able to control. And that was in composition. That was the way to get through that.
Yeah. Skipping ahead a little bit with the God of War video games, which, when I was growing up, these games, and they still are, they're like these legendary games. People were just obsessed with them and couldn't wait for the next one. And I was very much part of that group. And one thing that I think is so great with your music is that these tracks are very heavy in percussion and wind instruments, but also with choirs. There are these great choir sequences in different parts of the soundtrack. Is that kind of... are choirs a fairly challenging component of doing music like this, or is it fairly even in terms of the challenge across the board?
Okay, so to give you some background there on the God of War, there was a number of us, actually. There was 4 major components of 4 different composers who, under the talents of the music, I would say, so Chuck Dowd was really the guy that was supervising the group. And then underneath him, he had also music supervisors. All of those people at Sony were really the intelligence of knitting together this crazy quilt of different composers and different styles. I'd say what they did the best was understanding who had the strongest aspect of music composition, and then assign those pieces to those composers that exhibited a song, more of a typical kind of a style that would fit. So that's truly the best use of music supervisors, understanding the talents of who you're working with, and then kind of shepherding them along. None of us were really known at that time in the video game world, and it was early enough in video games where you could make an impression, and still it wasn't such a risk factor involved in it, and then spending umpteenth millions of dollars on a particular game, and in particular the God of War series. Although the very first one was so it was interesting because the first one was the one that would set the stage for number 2 and number 3 of the God of War series as far as what the sound palette would be, which was heavy on percussion, very aggressive scoring, and choir. When you ask about the choir, I would say one of the very first things that the music supervisor that I worked with, his name was Clint Bajakin. He's just an extremely talented guy in his own right, wonderful to work with, just a great guy. And his very, very first thing was do not use any synth sounds, no synthesizer sounds. So it had to be organic, and that made it more interesting and complicated at the same time, because using organic sounds to create that kind of chaos in the orchestra and that kind of aggression was a bit challenging. But obviously we rose to the challenge because it became kind of an iconic soundtrack. Using the choir, you have to realize, so we were using, I believe in the very first one, we didn't really use much live. And then when it became such a success, then they said, okay, now we can mitigate risk and use live. So we had to use sample libraries that were available at that time. Using a choir is simpler than using a solo, because the large sound gets lost in detail. You can't tell it is lack of detail when you're using very large ensembles. So whatever was available, I know we all used whatever we had in our libraries. And then eventually it went to real singers, real choir on 2 and 3.
And in terms of all the different people and parts that you were describing, was the collaboration, so to speak, was it just you and a music supervisor, or were you also in contact with the other composers, or was it fairly closed off? You're just doing your part and then they're doing theirs.
Interesting question. So it was more silos. That's why I'm saying the group that was in charge of the God of War series at that time, which was spearheaded by Clint Bajakin, a group underneath and working with Clint, and Chuck Dowd, who was above him. That whole group was just extremely talented at being able to knit together a soundtrack that doesn't sound like, this guy wrote that, and this guy wrote that, and they have nothing to do with each other. But in reality, we didn't really have that much communication between the composers. I mean, if you want to lift up the phone and say, how are you doing? Yeah. But sure. We didn't say, hey, let me hear what you've just written, because I'm going to be writing something that's just like that. So we didn't do that at all. And, the guys from Sony made sure that it all made sense in the large scale of what the whole game would be. So they really controlled who they were talking to and who they were assigned to get a piece of music out of, and make sure that it was fitting within the universe of God of War. I'd say on God of War 3, there was slightly more collaboration, but then again, it was assigned by the music supervisor saying, could you take this theme and work it into the next piece, for Hades or something like that. And somebody might have worked the other theme, and I were to take that theme and work it within Hades. So there was a little bit more of the collaboration on God of War 3.
Gotcha. And, what's cool about those games is it's very mythological and fantastical. Was it pretty fun getting to play within that kind of world?
Great. It was great. A lot of fun. I mean, when you have, so let's say I would be assigned Kronos. So it'd say, okay, Kronos, and you look up an encyclopedia, what's Kronos? It's like, okay, 30-foot guy, huge. And you read about his background. What was nice about it was so colorful. Or writing for the Medusa, or writing for some of these characters, extremely colorful characters, obviously being mythological and having a lot of interesting background to them. It lends more instrumentation could be so different for these kind of characters. And I'm a huge fan of Bernard Herrmann, who used to write a lot of stuff. Yeah. So not that I could pull out a harp and just do some wild stuff on it, but it made you think differently. It wouldn't be like, okay, we're just going to do an ostinato line on the strings and be done with it. I tried at least to pull some oddball sounds that I could then use within the music, and it made me feel like I was connecting to the particular character I was writing for.
Right. And with that, I also wanted to make sure to touch on that same aspect with some of the Batman games, like Batman Arkham City and Asylum, because those games deal with these really crazy supervillains who are just so psychologically, disturbed, and as well as, of course, dealing with Batman. Was it again, not to be too repetitive, but what was the process like of doing music for a world like Batman, where the characters are so eccentric in a lot of ways and so stylized, and also similar to God of War, they're also very iconic. Was that a pretty interesting project or projects to work on?
Yes, it was, because Rocksteady at that time wasn't really that well known as a development studio, especially with Arkham Asylum. And so it was interesting watching kind of a group come onto themselves. Like they all of a sudden developed, unbeknownst to a lot of people who weren't under like the constant radar of what Warner Brothers and Eidos was looking at. So they were really working and just creating a really marvelous game without a lot of interference from the upper echelon of supervisors and people here in the United States. By the time that we were aware of what they were really doing, it became obvious that they had something really good going on there. Now, as far as I worked with Nick, who was the audio director for Rocksteady, and this gentleman knows how to write music. So it was a pleasure, talking to him or working with him. On some stuff, it was more of a concept that he would give me, and then you go and write a piece of music based on that. And some others was like, okay, Mad Hatter. Well, I'm just going to write something that's really mad,
Sure.
really kooky, oddball and screwy. For a Scarecrow, it obviously I had to feel like a bad trip, like hallucination. Certain things were clear. Joker, I always thought was kind of interesting to write. His theme to a certain extent was a waltz, because there's something about him that just seems like he's electric, and yet he's very light on his toes. And I thought it would be interesting if he were to dance a waltz for some reason. And so I wrote kind of a very odd waltz for him. And to give you a great example is Clayface Boss battle. When I was dealing with Nick, who has a background in conservatory from England, he told me, think of The Rite of Spring. And I went, wow, that's great. I mean, that's a heck of a piece to listen to and try and come up with a concept that might work for Clayface. And the whole thing of Clayface Boss, which is a difficult piece, is that the time on it, it changes from all kinds of time signatures, and it constantly is changing around. The reason why I thought that would be an interesting thought is because Clayface himself is always changing. So it would be interesting to have the music constantly also changing meter. And so I wrote that one in 7 and 5 and 4 and all kinds of different meters, because it never settles, which is kind of fun.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing with just what you've been talking about already is like, I think that while, getting to work on your own in a lot of ways could be a great process, it seems like the different collaborations that you've been able to do across these different games, whether it's the music supervisors or other composers or whoever it may be, it seems like that would be such a creatively stimulating partnership or process.
Well, if I was audio directing, which I actually did do in Disney consumer products, but not in these games. If first of all, these two titles basically that you mentioned obviously were handled well by whoever was in charge of doing these particular projects. The saying that composers, generally speaking, oddly enough, I think are kind of loners in a large sense. Band members, it's something else. If you're in a band and you're playing and you're creating music right there on stage, because I used to play in nightclubs for 36 years or something, a long time. So basically, when you're playing with other people, you need to communicate immediately right then and there. I mean, you are creating on the fly, and you're communicating with however many band members you might have. When you're composing something, it's a kind of a different thing, in particular with the way studios are now set up, where you have, gobs of RAM, and you can emulate a full orchestra, and you can create hybrid scores and all that kind of stuff. There's almost no need to be sitting with somebody else,
right,
and working with somebody else. You can, and people do, but I would say that it's not common that is done.
Well, shifting gear a little bit, I think one really interesting part of your career that you had mentioned right at the very beginning is your work with different theme parks. Like you've done some with Walt Disney and others.
Yeah.
What's the process? I guess to narrow it down, like if you get whether it's a ride or an attraction of whatever kind, what are the process of getting started to doing music for something like that? Like, do you get guidelines from the company or director, so to speak, or like how do you get started with that kind of project?
I would say that they're similar in only one regard, and that is in theme parks, and there are different kinds of rides. And I was in Walt Disney Imagineering sound department for 8 years, so I experienced that for quite a long time. Theme parks actually, when you're composing and you're considering how you're writing with moving through space. Most likely, and it's not always the case either, but if you're doing a dark ride, you're moving through areas, and how the music affects you in a particular area or a zone has to be considered very seriously when you're considering writing the whole score. So you have to take pieces and segments and write that way. So in that regard, it almost feels slightly interactive, because it's not a completely like we start here 1 hour and we finish down at the end of the movie. It's in sections, and all sections need to work together in little pieces, as it were. So that's very similar in a way to video game scoring. And that's the only thing that I think is similar, because in video games, I'm not literally moving through different spaces, and how I'm affected by one room has a lot to do with the next room I will be in. So if I'm doing a video game score, that is really kind of, it is the place that I'm in, and I could be there for like a half an hour, depending how well I'm doing the video game. In usually a dark ride, there's an exact amount of time that I'm in a particular zone.
Right.
So that, we know exactly how long I'm going to be there. Also, the difference is in video games, some people have the opportunity to actually play the game and install the music themselves and see how it's doing. Other reality is that you kind of given a general description of something and go write something, and then we'll critique it after you've written and handed it in. And if it's perfect, we'll just stick it in the game. If it's not, whatever. In a theme park, you're usually dealing right away with the media designer or whoever's liaison between the show director and yourself as a composer. And it's very clear beforehand exactly what you'll be writing and how long it'll be and what you expect to be feeling in that particular zone. And zones just compromise the whole ride. They could be broken up into 10 zones, 12 zones, whatever.
Right.
There's a lot of discussion. And also there's a tremendous amount of money going towards a ride that's only 3.5 minutes long, let's say, right? In a video game, it could be 20 hours of experience, 40 hours of experience. It could be the same amount of money going into both, but one is a very short, predictable experience, and the other one is not predictable.
And now, just because I've never been a part of that process, when you're doing music, like for example, I think one of the recent ones you worked on was this Pacific Rim attraction. Are you like when you're describing the different zones and talking to people, are you like there seeing it, or are you getting like footage of it or pictures? Like,
oh yeah, great question. Yeah. Okay, so because generally speaking, there's again in video games, people are working on a level, right? So it could be 2, 3, 4 people working on a level, and it could change at any time. Like all of a sudden, let's take out the helicopters, instead, let's put a jet. Oh, let's not have any jet. Let's not have any helicopters. Okay, why don't we just, and so you could be running after a rabbit down a hole for video games. When you're actually building a building that might cost $100 million to build this building, aren't that many changes. So, you got to be really clear about what it is exactly you're doing at any time. And you're working usually with the team to a certain extent. You're working with the team, making sure that everything is exactly what you thought it was going to be. And there isn't a massive change. So when you're doing it like I did Pacific Rim, you can't literally be there until they've built the building. So you have to pre-visualize what it is that it's going to be like. So generally speaking, there's usually a previs team that builds the length of the ride and what you'll be seeing on the ride. And it's usually within, and again, we're talking about within feet of being accurate. And it could even be centimeters of being accurate. This has nothing to do with a video game whatsoever.
Right.
It's dealing with distance, physical distance. So, when I audio directed those 2 dark rides last year in Indonesia, before I ever got there, everything was worked out beforehand. I mean, I did the sound design, the mix, supervised, installed the mix on site, and worked with in both cases, there were different composers, which was fun working with them because neither of them had really that much experience doing rides, one person more than the other, but I knew exactly how to compose for those particular zones so that when we got on site, there wouldn't be any question as to how the music is knitted together on site.
That sounds like such a, because I've really never had any experience with it. That sounds really interesting. I mean, and because even though there are those kind of strict guidelines, I feel like as you were saying, it is very different from video games or movies, and so I feel like that would be a cool process to be a part of.
It's a great process because within 3.5 minutes to 4.5 minutes, which is usually the longest ride, is 4.5 minutes, you have to deliver a message that you cannot forget. Now,
right.
In audio terms also, on like Pac Rim, for instance, one of the longest rides I've ever been on. You got off the ride, you got back on the ride. It was the most complex mishmash. It was fascinating. It was something these guys attempted that nobody's attempted before. But that being said, you have to pack a big experience into a very short amount of time. And when I mixed it real hot, like it's a rock concert. And when you pass through that thing and you finish, you knew you experienced something. There's no question. When you got off of that vehicle, you went like, yeah, okay. Now, a movie could be 1.5 to 2 hours. It has a long time to express itself. In a ride, it's jam-packed. And if you're lucky, you have a great sound system, as I had in Pac Rim, where you have like 4,000 watts per room. You can really experience a theatrical experience in a very short amount of time. But again, syncing of the sounds that might be coming from the actual vehicle and syncing it to speakers that are in the room is another discipline that has to be understood, how to sync all these sounds together in real time.
Yeah. And I think just being someone who enjoys these kinds of attractions, it is cool to think about, like, at least for me, when, one of the things I always remember is the music, or like when you think of, theme parks in a lot of ways, it's like, pieces of iconic music. So it's kind of cool getting to create music that so many people are going to experience and connect with and kind of have that memory when they leave,
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like if it's a small world after all, right? If it's a piece that is like 1 minute in length, for instance, and it's being played numerous different ways, it tends to, burn a hole in your head. You get off the ride, you can't forget it because you've heard it 8 different times. And then there's other rides which are more sound design. It's okay. As being an audio director, it's a fascinating thing. Having done sound design and music, these two disciplines are very different in a lot of ways. Sound design to me is kind of a wow factor of the moment. It's very difficult to leave anything you've ever heard in sound design and go, yeah, man, I remember that sound. That let me hum that sound. It doesn't really stay with you, but it's like popcorn. You're eating it. When you're experiencing it, it's kind of a rush. It's a high. Listening to sound design. Music, on the other hand, is something that you can possibly leave remembering what it was that you experienced, because it was a melody of some sort or something like that. And you can walk away remembering it. But sound design is something that delivers a punch immediate, and very different experience. The two of them, two different.
Yeah. And now, just because I am very curious, like with sound design, what are the kinds of sounds are you producing? Like it sounds like a really vague, broad question, but I'm really just curious as to what are examples of things that you do for the sound design projects?
It's an interesting question. So as a composer, I don't limit myself to that's what a violin should do, or that's what a French horn should be doing here, or any of those kinds of things. I really, initially, I consider sound, music is just part of sound. To me, it's organized sound. But every instrument has a particular palette or a tone to it. And then there are instruments that don't have any tone or palette to it that is recognizable instantly. That to me is sound design. So it's a wide open experience. It could be anything, and I mean anything, right? So it could be just a low frequency that hums along in the background and you don't know you're hearing it, but it's playing along with the music. It could be a screech. It could be a scream backwards. It could be something squashed and mashed until it's mutilated and you have no idea what it is anymore. It depends what you want to express at that particular point in time. So I've used sound design a lot, actually, in God of War, where I thought, having an orchestra just doing whatever they do is really cool, but I can also create something inside the music that's just really bizarre, which is comprised of really sound design elements and not necessarily a C major chord,
Yeah. And because you're someone who has spent so much time in that world, especially with sound design, when you're, whether it's, I don't know, going to theme parks or, watching a movie, whatever it may be, do you kind of just inherently notice the sound design or the music, or is that something you just kind of, or not? Because you are so experienced with it, are you noticing that more so than another kind of person might?
Yeah, that's a real interesting, easy question to answer. Yes. I do listen very carefully and I analyze a lot what I hear, because in order to continue learning from me, it means I need to continue to listen carefully to what other people are doing. And so when you listen to other people, including sound design or music, whatever that might be, that should inform you as an artist of what other people are doing. So in that regard, what you were saying about collaborative, it's collaborative in the fact that I'm listening to other people producing things and going, wow, that person just did something that is just so cool. And I really need to express that myself. I need to understand what that person did and absorb that. And then somewhat later, hopefully that comes back through me, filtered through my sensibility. And so that's how I kind of grow as an artist. Otherwise, I'd still be making music that sounds like it comes from the 1980s. So you got to keep moving along. So I do listen and learn. That's how I grow. As I analyze, listen, and absorb, things that are going on around me.
Yeah. And I think one reason that I think as I got more into video games and movies, and I think the sound design, it always amazes me how much complexity and detail that goes into something like that, because there are so many different, again, movies or TV shows, video games, where like the sound design and the overall sound work can really make it an incredible movie in a lot of ways. And I just always, that's something that I always love hearing when I go see a movie or something similar, where that sound design is so incredible. And you just think about the amount of work that probably went into generating that.
Okay, so it's interesting what you're saying. The sound design, even in music scores these days, is highly sought after. If you look at Trent Reznor
Hmm.
and the work he's doing with his compatriot there,
Sure.
look like the girl with the dragon tattoo, which was a very interesting score.
Hmm.
The score doesn't fit anything that would be like what Stokowski might have written or whatever, or certainly not what Beethoven would have written. But the thing is, does it fit the movie, and does it make the movie even more of an experience? And I absolutely believe that the blue that movie has, the cold, Oslo, Norwegian winters, and everything up is blue in that movie. A lot of it, and listening to his score makes me feel exactly what I'm looking at. I feel listening to it.
Mm.
But that score has a lot to do with sound design. It has not that much necessarily to do with a typical score. And when you speak about sound design almost kind of moves from music into the realm of sound manipulation. But you'd be amazed if you just look at people that I used to have like an office at Warner Brothers. And if you look at how these people work through a movie, you'd be shocked at the amount of detail that goes into all the aspects of sound that you just take for granted. Like, it's already just, oh yeah, sure, there's a background there, but they're putting all those backgrounds in there. They're making you feel where you actually are. It's amazing how much work goes into all these things. And if you listen to something like Pacific Rim, there is so much work involved in that movie.
Oh yeah.
It is insane. Same with Transformers. All these very high effect laden films have enormous amounts of tracks going on there. I mean, it could be hundreds and hundreds of tracks of sound effects.
Yeah, that's a good point, because when I was growing up, that's something I really didn't pay attention to. But as I've gotten more well versed in it, it's like you can rewatch like some of the movies you've mentioned, and it's like you're almost when you listen for that, it's almost like seeing a whole different film, because it's a whole other layer that is there. Yeah. You could explore so much.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could lose yourself, and like if I'm lucky, I had a Pacific Rim delivered to me with that, and I could just mute the dialogue for this particular show that I was doing. This is great. And I'm listening to what these guys did on the sound effects, and absolutely, I mean, my respect goes out to my admiration for the sheer amount of work. When you just kill the dialogue and you go like, oh, Lord, man, this is just layer upon layer upon layer. It's just so much stuff. And everything is cut to perspective, like when the guy is farther away, when he's close. Every one of these sounds that are creating all that you're hearing is always mixed in perspective, which means you're always following the character. If he's closer or farther, moving left and right. Just that is an amazing amount of work. And it goes on for minutes at a time. Like, it's just astounding. If you mute the music, you really get to hear just how much work went into that.
Right. But along with the ones that you've mentioned, are there any other films, TV shows, anything like that in particular that stand out to you as over the last few years, perhaps, that have really wowed you?
Oof. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I have to think about. There's a lot that wows me. There's some more than others. And then it depends on what you can't always tell is what a director's told the composer to do. So what he's actually responsible for having chosen himself, or what the director has told him to do, or if he's following a temp track that the director has already figured out for him. Generally speaking, I'm always fascinated by the composers that have a voice, their own voice. Danny Elfman is amazing because he just has his own approach. Everything comes through Danny Elfman's psyche. I think he's tremendous. I think James Newton Howard is amazing. I think Tom Newman has figured out his own sound that everybody wants,
Yeah.
But when he first did, like, Shawshank Redemption, to me is one of the greatest scores. Fantastic. Yeah. But it was the very first time I heard that way of scoring, and I went, that's fantastic. Who is that guy? So, it's like, it was great. John Powell's done some amazing scores. The How to Train Your Dragon series is a remarkable score.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of lost in the mix there, but when you listen just to the score, you go like, what magnificent work. It's great. So there's amazing talents out there. Of course, Hans Zimmer, everybody knows that, or whoever is working with Hans on a particular score. So there's amazing talents out there. So I generally like to listen to some of these guys who have their own voice, no matter where. I mean, even my daughter and we go to a movie and she'll go, "Oh, that's Thomas Newman." She'll go, "That's Thomas. Oh, that's probably Hans." But she already knows because she grew up in my studio here listening to me scoring. She'll go, "Oh, I know who that is." I mean, we almost have this game, listen to like the opening credits, go, "Who is that?" And you go, James Newton. It's just great. So you listen to these artists and they put their own stamp on whatever they've been asked to score. And I think that's just terrific. Also, Alexander Desplat he has his own approach to how he's going to score something. And eventually, I believe that directors trust these artists to bring their own soul or psyche to a project, notwithstanding that they don't, obviously, they listen to what a director has to tell them, but it isn't like they're trying to follow some other artist, because otherwise you bother asking them to score it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point, because, really all these people that you've mentioned, I love it as well. And I think how you put it is great, is where they have their own voice. It's not necessarily they're always working with a great director or on a great script. It's like they in whatever way they're able to bring their own voice to that project. And sometimes I've gotten into the habit of even seeking out a score before I see a film, or sometimes just going to see a movie for that composer, and it's like, as we've been talking about, it's kind of addicting once you catch it.
Yeah. I mean, in order for me to, as I mentioned, in order for me to grow and aspire to be better at what I do, I listen to some of these really well dedicated and very talented composers and realize that, I might have scored it this way, but he did it that way. Interesting. And so, you constantly listening in order to learn, but you can also, of course, just listen in order to really appreciate these artists' work. And that's what I presume you're mentioning. It's just like, this is great. I may not be sitting here and being asked to score something like that, but you can listen to it and go, that's just great work. It's wonderful. And it moves me, because if music doesn't move you, I don't know why you would do it. So it's got to be this kind of a passion thing anyway. And that's how I've lived my life, with being passionate about what I produce, or, what I score. I do feel like somewhere, I think I have a voice, because people tell me that I have like a style, but the style really is my voice. It's the way I hear music and the way it filters through my sensibilities. And, I always hope that there is something about the way I score something that somebody could say, "Oh, that could be Ron Fish. I think it's Ron Fish." Whatever,
Yeah.
The greatest compliment that you can have.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, Ron, it's so nice chatting with you. I feel like I've already learned so much more that I could probably take in. But is there anything else in particular that I haven't mentioned, or perhaps anything coming up that you'd like to discuss, or have we kind of touched on some of the major points?
I think, I'm asked a lot over the years, like, is it worthwhile getting into business? How do you get into business and all that kind of, and that always seems to come up. And, I guess somebody listening to this, since I've been doing this quite a while, maybe would want to know what I think of that. Because that seems to come up a lot. And so, there's a lot of people coming out of Berkeley. There's a lot of people coming out of these different schools, who contact composers and ask them, "Hey, can I intern?" And I taught briefly at USC, and it's fascinating. You have some really talented composers. Some of them, of course, like James Newton Howard, came out of USC. So, I mean, some really good talents there. So how do these people make their mark is an interesting thing. I do believe that working with a composer that might be very busy at a particular point in time is a way of getting your feet wet in whatever it is that you want to do. So if it's film or TV work or video games, whatever is available, or theme parks, the best way to get in is to be working with a composer and as an intern or whatever, as a helper, whatever it might be. And then usually the next question is, how do I do that? And you do that by becoming indispensable in using the tools that composers use, which would be like Vienna Ensemble Pro, Contact, Cubase, AnyDAW, Logic, any of the popular ones. Unfortunately, you need to be able to get around all these different things because almost every composer is using a different situation, like a different combination of all these.
Right.
But the people that I know that have kind of come out from just helping somebody else and getting a foot in the door, realistically, that seems to be the way to go. Unless you happen to have a direct contact with somebody that's a music supervisor and they're willing to give you a shot at it. And that's another way to go. But if you do not have a direct contact with somebody who could be hiring, then work with a composer that has just too much work on their hands and they need some help. And then, you start working with a composer. Before you know it, maybe you get a cue on your own. And then, then your resume starts becoming more like, this is what I did, not just what I'm helping this big name composer. And so it's called paying your dues. And that's a way to get in.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because I think it could be a kind of a daunting field to start out in. And, I think as you're saying, you kind of just got to put yourself out there and you really never know what you may find or who you may connect with.
Oh, yeah. Networking is definitely so important. In particular now, since social media, everybody's looking at everybody else. It's a wide open world. Also, of course, people are doing their own compositions. It is no more like you have to go to Warner Brothers to get something heard or, Capitol Records. Everybody can publish anything. Everybody can be heard. So that there's, literally thousands of people composing. There's thousands of people putting stuff out. So it's more about like, okay, if everybody could be heard at the same time, what makes me different than anybody else is basically working with somebody who already has busted through the network and is already working or touring or, has songs out on, Spotify, whatever it is. It's hooking up with somebody that's already busted through all this social networking and is, risen above the general din. That makes the most sense to me that I can figure.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, Ron, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I've really enjoyed it, and you're welcome back whenever you'd like. If there's another project rolls around, would love to get you back on sometime.
Yeah, I'm working actually on a video game called Batora.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can get back together sometime down the line. But yeah, thank you so much again, and please stay safe and take care. Okay, and I hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. You too, Henry. Stay safe in these more difficult times.
Thank you.
All righty.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, everybody. I think that is about it for the show this week. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your way out. Thank you so much. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Music Buds. Check out themusicbuds.com. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we'll see you next time.